Hello, I'm Michael, and if you're here, it's because you're as attracted to fear as I am. Ready for today's story? My name is Severiano, and I work as a watchman and gravekeeper in the municipal cemetery of a remote town. My job involves ensuring that no one enters the cemetery at night, assisting in cleaning the graves, watering the flowers, and digging graves for the recently deceased. It is not a very pleasant task, but I enjoy being in contact with nature and the serenity that is perceived in this place. I worked here for over 2 decades, and nothing unusual or supernatural had ever happened to me. Beyond the tourists who arrive these days to try to perform their deceptive rituals, or simply to carry out urban explorations, where, by the way, they never find anything and always invent supernatural situations to instill fear. However, in reality, that is something else. As for me, I have always been a skeptical and logical individual who does not trust apparitions or spells. However, everything changed a few months ago. When I found a grave that I was not informed about, it was an everyday day. I had just started my night shift, and as part of my daily routine, I chose to take a tour of the cemetery to confirm that everything was in order. It was at that moment when I observed her. It was a grave that I had never seen before, located in the least visited and neglected area of the cemetery. It was made up of ancient plaques and materials, as if it were a tomb from a previous period, and had a rusty iron cross on its top. The name of the deceased, Maria Dolores Garcia Perez, was written on the tombstone. Under the name there was a date of birth, October 13, 1993, and a date of death, October 13, 2023. This implied that he had died on the same day he celebrated his 30th birthday. This circumstance left me reflective. I kept a record of all the graves present in the place, and only the grave of Maria Dolores should not be present. However, the first thing I thought was that, possibly, it was a newly made tomb, which the pantheonist from the previous shift had forgotten to write down in the logbook. However, all this still had strange tones, since the tomb did not seem recent. It seemed like it had been there from the beginning. After careful analysis of the tomb, I was perplexed. It seemed that the earth that covered it had not been removed recently, and in that moment I realized that something was not right. I walked towards my cabin, and I couldn't get rid of a series of theories about what could have happened. However, honestly, nothing persuaded me. When I got home, I sat down and, like every night, while I ate a cup of coffee and smoked a cigarette, I began to search social networks and the internet for any clue about the identity of Maria Dolores Garcia Perez. However, I didn't find anything about this. The hours passed, and gradually my attention focused on other issues, which occasionally left aside what happened to the enigmatic tomb. Around 2:50 in the morning, my sleep was abruptly disturbed. This originated from an anguished cry, like a melody of suffering that immediately infected me with its melancholy. These circumstances were common in the Pantheon, since it was common for many relatives, in their mourning, to go late at night to cry and say goodbye to their loved one. It was an emotion that always caused pain. However, there are aspects of life. As always, I took my lamp and headed towards the place where the crying came from, just to ensure that everything is in order and provide my support in whatever is required if the person needs it. However, on this occasion everything was different, and I must admit that even I, being a genuinely anti-believer person, experienced fear at what happened. It was the enigmatic tomb. The cries came from there, and next to her was a woman dressed in black. She covered her face with a veil. She was kneeling on the floor, sobbing desperately. It seemed like he was praying or talking with death. I approached her with interest and consideration. I thought that perhaps it was a relative or friend of the deceased who had come to say goodbye to her. "Hello, ma'am." I received it with a delicate voice. "I could help you with something." The woman raised her head and looked at me with an intense, black gaze that warmed my blood. Her face was white and soft, with delicate and beautiful features. She had long black hair that extended to her shoulders. She was a young and beautiful woman, but with an expression of melancholy and sadness that tore at my spirit. "No, thank you," he answered with a soft and sad voice. "I just want to share a moment with her." "With her too?" Question without understanding. Had he met her? "Yes, she was my sister," he replied with a forced smile. The unfortunate thing was that he died on his birthday. "I'm very sorry," I expressed myself honestly. "What happened to him?" "It was a mishap," he clarified with a hoarse voice. She was driving her vehicle on public roads when a truck approached her and hit her. He lived in that moment. "I am deeply sorry," I murmured in terror. "And there was no witness or culprit?" "No, the truck escaped, and no one could identify it," he expressed to me angrily. "It was a disproportion." I am deeply sorry, ma'am, I repeated with empathy. And his name? My name is Maria Dolores, she told me with an atypical look. I was surprised to hear his name. It was the same as that of the deceased. How could it be? Would they become twins? Or by chance would they have the same name? Maria Dolores? Like your sister? Yes, like my sister, he confirmed with a melancholic smile. They named us the same because we were born on the same day. We were equal. Hearing his explanation, I was speechless. It was a rather peculiar and somber encounter. Two twin sisters with the same name who had been born on the same day. It was like a punishment. How interesting. Yes, very curious, she told me with a voice that seemed sarcastic to me. However, life is like that. Sometimes it gives you surprises, and sometimes it takes them away from you. I stared at her with a combination of surprise and sadness. I had no idea what else to express to her or how to console her. I felt very isolated and miserable seeing that she had lost her only friend in the world. Well, ma'am, I'm leaving, I finally told her, trying to say goodbye. If you require anything, you can call me. I find myself here daily. Thank you, Severiano, she told me, naming me by my name. I was amazed to hear that he knew my name. He had not informed anyone, nor was he carrying any identification. How did he know it? How can I know my name? I questioned him with interest. I know everything about you, Severiano, she told me with an enigmatic smile. I have been following you for a long time. Hearing his words, I shuddered. It seemed to me that there was something dark and risky about that woman, something that I couldn't explain or understand. I felt a chill run down my spine and cold sweat break out on my face. What does it mean exactly? I questioned him with concern. No, she responded with a slight laugh. It's just a joke. Do not be afraid, Severiano. I will not cause you any harm. She looked at me with a look that captivated me and drew me towards her. I felt a curious interest in that woman who I considered the most beautiful and the most tragic that I had witnessed in my existence. Goodbye, Severiano, she expressed to me with a captivating voice. We will meet again soon, and please do not inform anyone or ask anything about this tomb. After this, he rose and withdrew from the tomb, leaving me alone and perplexed. It was the first meeting I had with Maria Dolores, the girl from the Pantheon. Truly, I was fascinated by the beauty of that woman and very loyal to her statements. I chose not to reveal anything to anyone, with the only hope that one day I could see her again. The weeks passed, and every day I made my tours, always with the intention of finding the enigmatic woman. It seems that he had overcome his mourning, or at least had come to terms with it. Therefore, I also resigned myself and thought I would never see her again. However, this was not what I imagined. On a cold night where the wind was blowing more intensely than usual, I was in my sentry box. After reading a Lovecraft book, I was ready to go to bed, so I set my alarm and closed my eyes. Ignoring the time that had passed, I heard male screams coming from the cemetery. I quickly picked up my flashlight, my baton, and my pepper spray, and then I was guided by the screams that were gradually decreasing in intensity until they became soft whimpers. Directed only by my auditory sense, I pursued the sound until I decided to stop at the place that disturbed me the most in the entire cemetery, the enigmatic tomb. Up to this point, I must reiterate that I was not afraid of anything, but right at that moment, a great fear overwhelmed me, since what I saw instantly was not something supernatural but something dark and bloody. A human piece could be seen surrounding the tomb of Maria Dolores. The arms, legs, and other parts of the body were restricted. The first thing I thought was that it was the work of the drug trafficker, since in my free time I had seen compelling videos of how the hitmen killed their adversaries. However, I also found it very peculiar that this scene emerged right around the girl's grave. I didn't have much doubt about what I should take, and I quickly headed home, locked my door, and called the police. After 30 minutes, various patrols showed up at the cemetery. Within the state and National Guard teams, large caliber weapons were presented. Once there, I allowed them to enter, and they questioned me about what had happened. I told them everything I had observed, and they asked me to take them to the scene. But to my astonishment and that of the security agents, nothing existed. Everything was normal and serene, without a drop of blood. I faced a heavy assault from the police and was threatened with arrest if I made any prank of that nature again. Almost with tears in my eyes, I tried to clarify to them that nothing was a joke and that I had witnessed everything I had told them. They all looked at me with a look of discomfort, and without further comment, they left. He did not understand what was happening, since he was convinced of what he had witnessed. I don't drink alcohol, much less drugs, and to the best of my knowledge, I promise you that I saw the mutilated body. After this, great sadness overwhelmed me, and resentment did not allow me to rest, since I was not completely happy with what had happened. In those moments, I wondered about the veracity of everything I had witnessed and experienced in the last few days. I was so surprised that I even distrusted my mental well-being. That same feeling made me question whether I had really witnessed Maria Dolores, sister of the deceased and victim of the impulse. I couldn't stop talking to my superior and asking about the origin of that tomb that, since its appearance, had only brought bad fortune to my existence. After this, 2 calm days passed until, once again, something very negative happened again. One day, around 10 at night, while I was doing my tasks, I experienced an impulsive attack of anxiety and quickly decided to call my superior so he could definitively clarify everything I had about that tomb. However, unusually, a murmur of a female voice began to resonate in my mind telling me, "Don't do it." I went to the phone to check if anyone was nearby, but there was no one. However, that murmur remained constant, and I heard it repeatedly. Although the weather was winter at that moment, I left the hut, and that whisper transformed into a firmer phrase, with a voice that clearly urged me not to do it. As on previous occasions, guided by my hearing and my lamp, I headed to the place of origin of that voice, and once again, I reached the tomb of Maria Dolores. This time, the woman I had previously witnessed was sitting there again. On this occasion, he was not crying, but his eyes reflected a melancholy never seen before. However, there was something that remained unchanged in her, and it was her majestic beauty that, despite her paleness, intensified more and more. "Hello, Severiano," he expressed to me with a serious voice. At that moment, a sudden drop in temperature was experienced, and, with lips trembling from the cold, I responded, "Hello." She smiled and let me see her white teeth, and then answered me, "I appreciate that you have preserved our secret." Then he approached me and gave me a kiss on the cheek. Then he walked away, disappearing into the darkness of the night and the gloomy scene that symbolized the tombs in contrast to the winter cold. As for me, I stayed on my feet and was not worried when a light squall fell, signaling that the cold was approaching its most marked phase. I wasn't worried that that woman's lips felt so cold, crossing the line of natural. I just felt spellbound. I think that's the expression. At 45 years old, I was a single man with little luck in relationships, and having such a beautiful woman bump into me, revealing her great secrets to me, had fascinated me. From that moment on, I chose to be his collaborator as much as possible, and my job was simple. It was increasingly common to hear sobs asking for help and screams that tore through the pain. I just waited a few minutes, and when the complaints stopped, I planned to look at what happened. I always ran into the same situation. Distressing and painful situations. Decapitated, mutilated men, pale as paper, sometimes with fragments attached around the tomb and even on the trees. Initially, I was scared to death, but then I fell into the habit, and it became habitual to me. I assumed, just like all of you who are listening to my story, that all of these violent actions were provoked by the living twin, Maria Dolores, and were not linked to organized crime as I initially thought. I no longer cared about calling the police, my superior, or anyone else to report what was happening, as I knew beforehand that it would only lead to trouble. I often captured images and videos of all crime scenes, but they were still enigmatic. The images showed nothing, absolutely nothing. It seemed like only I could capture everything that was happening there. Maybe you consider that I am entangled, but that is not the case, and I will not lie to you. I never gave up the idea that I was. However, I noticed that the local news mentioned a serial killer who randomly killed men. It was not certain whether it was a man or a woman, but the authorities only knew that they were all taken when they left bars or seedy cantinas. They often showed images or verbal portraits of the victims, and I also had the opportunity to recognize them by particular characteristics that I always observed in the bodies, even when they, in most cases, were mutilated. After numerous occasions in which I saw the lifeless bodies of the victims, I realized that when a crime was about to happen, the temperature in the cemetery decreased drastically. Thus, one day, I experienced a slight cold. My love, which intensified day after day for Mar Idol, as I affectionately called her, made me feel the urgency of seeing her. Therefore, I walked towards the tomb where his sister was and hid behind a nearby coffin. About 30 minutes passed when I heard laughter, and in the darkness a couple emerged, walking between laughter and flirting. It was Mar Idol with a man. At that moment, I experienced a strong pounding of my heart, and a fit of anger overwhelmed me. But that was little, since I did not know that something more serious would happen. Gradually, the kisses worsened in intensity, and then I observed that both Mar Idol and her lover in turn stripped off their clothes and surrendered to the sin of lust. In that instant, I felt myself crumble, and a fury immediately overwhelmed me. I experienced an almost uncontrollable desire to become that man who held my beloved woman with fervor, and even though I observed how Mar Idol, from one moment to the next, attacked the man as if he were a beast that was only interested in blood and the flesh of his victim, it didn't worry me, and at no point did I stop thinking that I wanted to give myself body and soul to that woman, despite what life cost me. At the conclusion of that mysterious ritual, the outcome was always the same, but, as I mentioned previously, nothing surprised me. As usual, when Mar Idol disappeared in the gloom of the tombs, I walked disappointed towards my home with a terrible feeling of betrayal towards myself, only thinking of repaying her. Over a long period of reading and documentation, I decided that Mar Idol was a peculiar species of witch or vampire, or perhaps both. Every page I looked at about this mentioned that there were several ways to eliminate a demon of such magnitude, and the alternatives included sprinkling his body with holy water, having a blessed cross come close to his body, or allowing him to be exposed to the sun. I completely ruled out the last alternative, since I had nothing to do during the morning shift, and a large volume of movement occurs during that time. It was unfeasible to carry out something of this type in the morning. The alternative of holy water seemed very appropriate to me, although it was not superior to that of the blessed cross, since my mother precisely had one of these in her home, and in essence, it would only be necessary to borrow it to break up with my beloved husband. Being confused about how to call her to arrive, I decided to do something I had never done before, and I think I would never do it in the future either. However, the most appropriate option was to desecrate her sister's grave, in the hope that she would somehow wake up and come to save her. Therefore, at the beginning of my shift, and confirming that there was no one else in the cemetery, I closed the gates, which, by the way, had never been closed before, and I headed towards the tomb of the deceased twin, Maria Dolores. Continuing there, I began to dig until I reached the old box, and after enormous effort, I managed to remove the lid. At that moment, my eyes widened in a clear display of astonishment. Maria Dolores was the same as Mar Idol, and that was what was amazing and enigmatic about the circumstance. Maria Dolores was intact, pale like her sister, with reddish lips and the same astonishing beauty. Despite the fear I experienced in this situation, I had not given up, and my desire for revenge surpassed anything. Once I uncovered the girl, I left her like this, illuminated by the moonlight. Without covering the grave, I left its hole, but to my amazement, when I came out, Mar Idol was right in front of me. At that moment, I experienced the decrease in temperature as on other occasions, and I quickly went to the tomb, but it was empty. There I understood that such a twin sister had never existed. That tomb had functioned throughout that time as the tomb of a nocturnal being. There was no longer uncertainty. My beautiful muse was a vampire. With a delicate look, the girl approached me. When I felt her so close, my anger prompted me to show her the cross to protect myself from her. However, the girl, still looking at me lovingly, took the cross and threw it far away from me. When Mar Idol touched the cross, his hand began to scorch, and a smoke like burning flesh was felt everywhere. However, Mar Idol seemed indifferent, and even though his hand was on fire, he never showed any signs of concern. Only when he got very close to me did he present his hand to me, which was incandescent. You examined it carefully, my dear Severian. The blessed cross can harm me, as you may notice. Then he extended his hand and closed it abruptly, and a cold wind came from his palm, extinguishing the fire immediately, although the burnt skin lesions still showed its limb. Then Mar Idol approached me, and as if by magic, I was completely paralyzed despite my desire to flee from that place. In a completely unexpected act, Mar Idol approached me and then kissed me on the mouth, a kiss full of love that made me feel alive, something I had never experienced. Then he looked at me intently and said, "I know how much you love me, and I also know that you want to be with me, but I can't please you. If I did, I would be cursing you, and your destiny would be no different from that of the men I have nurtured. I thank you deeply for preserving the secret. However, my work on this site has ended, and we will no longer see each other." Once again, she walked away into the darkness of the cemetery, this being the last time I saw her. The hours passed, and I don't know when I returned home. I had gone to bed. When I woke up, the first thing I did was go to Maria Dolores' tomb, but I could only see a piece of garden with a black rose that stood out among the others. Apparently, there was never any grave in that place, or at least there was no trace that there was. When I took my bus back home, The driver was listening to the radio, and they were discussing the Night Killer, as they had called him in the series. After police investigations, they discovered that all the victims belonged to a sect that kidnapped both animals and people to carry out atrocious rituals, and that unusually they had not been able to locate any of them, either in life or in death. In that moment, I reflected on what the police could do to find out everything I knew, that it was Mar Idol who had murdered them. Perhaps they were initially performed by their partners as a means to steal their essence or life, and concluded that ritual by devouring them alive. In reality, I don't know the reason for their existence, but what I can suggest is that you never fall in love with a vampire.